What's up, everybody? Hello and welcome to Not Your Average Meta, an MTG Commander channel dedicated to bringing you decks and commanders you wouldn't normally find in your average meta. This week's video is brought to you by our new channel sponsor, International MTG. If you're looking for competitive pricing on your favorite MTG cards, old and new, be sure to check out the International MTG store and TCG Player, link in the description of this video. This week on Not Your Average Meta, we have the conclusion to our 3-part Hobby Horse series, although that's not really true because we literally play there every week, but please enjoy the video anyways. First up this week, we have Patrick playing his Bant Super Friends deck being led by Derevi, Empyrial Tactician. This is a Planeswalker tribal deck that is built around using his Planeswalker's ultimate abilities to eventually lock his opponents out of the game. Next, we have Foil making another glorious return to the channel playing Colfenor, the Last Yew. This is a Toughness Matters deck that looks to use Colfenor's ability to bring creatures back based off their toughness from his graveyard to his hand for ultimate reoccurring value. Then we have Justin playing his Dimir Dragon tribal deck being led by Silumgar, the Drifting Death. This is Justin's spin on a Voltron equipment deck disguised as a tribal deck made up mostly of changelings instead of dragons. Finally, we have Fograw returning to the table with his mono-green Reki History of Kamigawa deck. This is still the same old Reki Value Engine deck that looks to cast legendary permanents in order to draw through his deck till he can overrun his opponents with a win con. Now that you have our fighters, let's step into the Thunderdome and see which deck will come out on top. Turn 1, Foil draws and plays a forest before paying 1 for Birds of Paradise. Justin draws and plays an island for turn. He then pays 1 and casts a Moth Dust Changeling. Fog draws and plays Nykthos for turn before passing. Patrick draws a turn and plays a forest. He then pays 1 for Noble Hierarch. Foil draws and plays a Lawn or Waste for turn. He then pays 1 for a Soul Ring, and then another 3 for Stone Coil Serpent, where X is equal to 4. Justin draws and plays another island for turn before paying 2 for Blackblader Forged. Fog draws and plays a forest for turn. He then pays 2 and casts his own Blackblader Forged and passes. Patrick draws, plays an island. Foil draws and plays a Snow-Covered Plains. He then takes a damage off his Lawn or Waste in order to tap out and cast his commander, Colfenor. Foil then goes to combat and swings a Serpent at Fog for 4 damage. Justin draws and then passes his turn. Fog draws and plays another forest. He then taps out and casts his commander, Reki. Patrick draws and plays a Plains. He then pays 4 to cast Teferi, Master of Time. Patrick then uptakes Teferi to draw a card and then discard a card. Foil draws and plays a tapped Scored Barrens for turn, gaining a life. He then goes to combat swinging his commander, Justin, while he swings a Serpent at Teferi. In response, Patrick down takes Teferi to phase out Foil's Serpent, preventing him from dealing damage while Justin takes 3 commander damage. Justin draws and plays a Swamp for turn. He then pays 2 to suspend Profane Tutor with 2 time counters on it. On his end step, Patrick uptakes Teferi to draw a card and discard a card. Fog draws for turn and then pays 3 life to pay an untapped Turn Timber Serpent Wood. He then pays 2 to equip his Blackblade to his commander and passes. On his end step, Patrick uptakes Teferi to draw a card and discard a card. Patrick draws a turn and plays an untapped Castle Vantress before paying 1 to cast a Sylvan Library. Patrick then uptakes his Teferi again to draw a card and discard a card. On his upkeep, Foil's Serpent phases back into play. Foil draws a turn and plays a tapped Snowfield Sinkhole. He then goes to combat swinging his commander and Serpent at Teferi. In response, Patrick uptakes Teferi to draw a card and discard a card before letting Teferi go to his graveyard. On his upkeep, Justin removes the counter from his Profane Tutor and then draws for turn. He then pays 3 for a Dragon's Horde and passes. Fog draws for turn and then pays 4 to cast a Great Hinge. He then draws off the Reki trigger before using the Hinge to cast Goshintai of Boundless Vigor. Goshintai then enters with a 1/1 counter while Fog gains 2 life and draws 2 cards. He then plays a Forest for turn and goes to his end step, paying 1 to put another counter on his Goshintai. Patrick draws and plays a Reliquary Tower for turn. He then pays 5 to cast a Cataclysmic Gearhulk. Each player then chooses an artifact, a creature, a planeswalker, and an enchantment from the permanents they control and sacrifice the rest. On his end step, Foil uses Nature's Claim to destroy Patrick's library and Patrick gains 4 life. Foil draws for turn and plays a Snow-Covered Forest before paying 3 for a Reclamation Sage, destroying Fog's Great Hinge. He then casts a Rampant Growth to go get a forest from his library to put into play. On his upkeep, Justin removes the last time counter off of his tutor and goes to search his library for a card. He then draws for turn and plays another Swamp before casting a Venomous Changeling, putting a counter on his Dragon's Horde. Fog draws for turn and then pays 2 to cast an Eye of Vecna, which has him losing 2 life and drawing 2 cards. He then pays another 2 to cast an Umezawa's Jitte, drawing off Reki. Patrick draws for turn and then pays 5 to cast Venser the Sojourner. He then uptakes Venser to exile his Gearhulk before casting a Mystical Tutor to go find an instant to put on top of his library. On his instep, the Gearhulk then comes back into play, and each player then chooses an artifact, a creature, a planeswalker, and an enchantment from the permanents they control and sacrifice the rest. Foil then returns a Serpent to his hand off his Colfenor trigger, and Justin casts Tragic Slip to take out Patrick's Gearhawk. Foil draws for turn and then goes to combat, swinging his Commander Adventure for 3 damage. He then taps out to recast his Serpent, where X is equal to 10. On his end step, Justin taps his Horde to remove a counter and draw a card. Justin then draws and plays another island for turn. He then taps out to cast his Commander Silumgar, adding another counter to his Horde. On his upkeep, Fog pays to use his Eye of Vecna, and he loses 2 life and draws a card. Fog then draws for turn and pays 3 for Nissa Vastwood Seer. He then goes to find a forest from his library to put in a hand, which he then puts into play for turn. Fog then flips Nissa into Nissa's Sage Animus and upticks her to reveal the top card of his library, which is not a land, so he puts it into his hand. He then pays 4 to cast Hall of Gemstone and passes. On his upkeep, Patrick chooses white through the Hall trigger and then draws for turn. He then upticks Venser to exile his Hierarch before paying to cast Day of Judgment to wipe the board of all creatures. Foil then returns his Reclamation Sage and Birds of Paradise to his hand through his Colfenor's trigger, and on his end step, Patrick returns the Noble Hierarch to play. On his upkeep, he then pays 1 to recast Birds of Paradise and another 3 to cast his Reclamation Sage to destroy Fog's Hall of Gemstone. Foil then casts Cultivate to go get a land from his library to put to play and another for his hand. Justin draws and plays another Swamp for turn. He then pays 3 for a Ghostly Changeling, putting a counter on his Horde. Justin then pays another 3 for an Heirloom Blade and passes. Fog draws for turn and then upticks his Nissa to reveal the top card of his library, putting a forest into play. Fog then taps out to cast Kamal's Druidic Vow, where X was equal to 6. Fog then reveals the top 6 cards of his library, putting to play all legendary permanents and lands with CMC 6 or lower. He then puts to play Arasta the Endless Web, Seraph the Viper's Fang, Zavala Heart of the Wilds, Baru Fist of Karosa, into forest. Patrick draws for turn and pays 3 to cast Party Jace, before uptaking him, having each player draw a card. Patrick then upticks Venser to exile his Noble Hierarch once again, and at his end step, the Hierarch returns to play. Foil draws and plays another land for turn before paying 8 to recast his Commander a second time. He then passes, and on his end step, Justin removes a counter from his Horde to draw a card. Justin draws for turn and then plays another Swamp before taps out to cast his Commander again, putting a counter on his Dragon's Horde. Fog draws and plays a Forest for turn. He then upticks Nissa, not revealing a land, putting it to hand. Fog then pays 2 to activate his Nykthos to create 8 green mana. He then uses 1 mana to activate Zavala to create an additional 5 mana. Fog then uses 5 of this to recast his Commander Reki, and then another 2 to cast Gulta Primal Hunger, drawing off his Reki and Zavala triggers. He then casts Azusa Lost But Seeking, drawing off the Reki trigger. Fog then plays another land off Azusa, and then casts Omnith Locus of Creation, drawing off the Reki trigger. He then pays 1 to use Seraph to untap Zavala before tapping her again to create another 12 green mana. Fog then casts Ronasi Indomitable, drawing off Reki, Yisan the Wanderer Bard, drawing off Reki, and Ovia Pashiri, Sage Lifecrafter, drawing off Reki. He then casts Nature's Lord to go get another forest to put to play. Fog then casts Yorvil, Lord of Garenbrig, drawing off Reki, Malira, Silvok Outcast, drawing off Reki, and Inara, Wolved Familiar, drawing off Reki. Patrick draws for turn and floats a white mana off his Hierarch before using Venser to exile her until end of his turn. He then pays to cast Time Wipe in order to wipe the board. In response, Fog casts Heroic Intervention, giving all of his creatures indestructible until end of turn. The rest of the board then gets wiped. Patrick then upticks Jace to have each player draw a card, and then he plays a Plains as his land for turn before passing. Foil draws and plays a tapped Arctic Treeline for turn. He then taps out to cast Old Stick Fingers where X was equal to 10. He then reveals cards off the top of his library until he reveals 10 creature cards, which he then puts into his graveyard. Justin draws and then plays a Rogue's Passage for turn. He then spitefully casts Drown in the Loch to take out Foil's only blocker, before paying 5 to cast Ilmarith, Desert Doom, adding a counter to his Horde. He then equips the blade to his dragon and removes a counter from his Horde to draw a card. Fog draws and plays 2 forests for turn, as well as a Pendlehaven. He then upticks Nissa to reveal a land, which he then puts into play. Fog then activates Nykthos, creating 21 green mana, and then uses 1 of the green mana to activate Zavala, creating an additional 14 green mana. He then casts Shigeki, Jeskai Visionary, drawing off Reki, Kamal, Heart of Karosa, drawing off Reki, Old Gnawbone, drawing off Reki, Patron of the Orochi drawing off Reki, and Galanra Call of Wildwood drawing off Reki. Folk then casts an Exploration and plays Gaia's Cradle as an extra land for turn. He then uses the Cradle to create 21 green mana, which he then uses to turn all his remaining lands into creatures, and swings out at his opponents for the win.
Alright, so we have Fograw with another win. Playing as the Degenerate decks. How's it feel to win again?
Feels pretty good to pick up another win, you know. Haters are going to say it's fake, but at this point it's about the same as walking or breathing. It just comes naturally, you know. But we'll see you next time for another great win. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you can see more games and decks you wouldn't normally see in your average meta.